In 1968, an American weapons depot in South Vietnam reported routine inventory. 2 days later, those same weapons killed 17 U.S. Marines. The serial numbers matched. Someone inside was arming the enemy, and the Pentagon knew. Vietnam, 1967. At the height of American involvement, the United States military was shipping weapons into Southeast Asia at an unprecedented rate. M16 rifles, M79 grenade launchers, claymore mines, artillery shells, enough firepower to arm multiple armies. The logistics were staggering. Every week, transport planes landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base carrying tons of ordnance. From there, weapons were distributed to dozens of depots across South Vietnam, managed jointly by American advisors and South Vietnamese military personnel. It was supposed to be foolproof. Multiple checkpoints, serial number tracking, armed guards, paper trails that documented every rifle from factory to battlefield. But something was wrong. In March of 1967, Captain James Richardson, a 29-year-old logistics officer from Ohio, noticed something unusual during a routine inspection at the Long Binh Weapons Depot. An entire pallet of M16 rifles, 40 weapons, was missing from the inventory. The paperwork showed they had been signed out for distribution to an ARVN unit. But when Richardson contacted that unit, they had no record of receiving the weapons. He reported the discrepancy to his commanding officer. He was told not to worry about it. Paperwork errors happened all the time in the chaos of war. 3 weeks later, another shipment went missing. Then another. Richardson began conducting unauthorized audits. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Weapons were disappearing from multiple depots across South Vietnam, always in significant quantities, always with paperwork that appeared legitimate but led nowhere. Richardson compiled his findings into a confidential report and submitted it through proper channels. He recommended an immediate comprehensive audit of all weapons depots and an investigation into potential theft. His report was classified and suppressed. What Richardson didn't know was that his investigation had touched something far more dangerous than simple black market theft. He had stumbled onto a systematic pipeline that funneled American weapons directly to the Viet Cong, and it was protected at the highest levels. The architect of this pipeline was a man Richardson had met several times, a man he had shared drinks with at the officers' club, a man who smiled and joked about the incompetence of military bureaucracy. Colonel Nguyen Van Tran, South Vietnamese Army, liaison officer for weapons distribution, and the most successful double agent the North Vietnamese Army had ever recruited. Colonel Tran wasn't working alone. The operation required American cooperation, whether knowing or willful ignorance. Someone on the U.S. side had to authorize the paperwork. Someone had to look the other way during inventories. Someone had to ensure that investigations like Richardson's went nowhere. The question that haunted investigators years later was simple. How high did it go? To understand the full scope of this betrayal, we need to understand how the system worked and how elegantly it was corrupted. The weapons distribution process involved multiple checkpoints. American forces would receive shipments at major air bases. These weapons would then be allocated to South Vietnamese units based on operational needs. The actual transfer required signatures from both American advisors and South Vietnamese officers. Colonel Tran's genius was identifying the weak points in this system. First, the language barrier. Most American logistics officers didn't speak Vietnamese. They relied on interpreters and local staff for paperwork. Tran controlled who those interpreters were. Second, the chaos. Vietnam was a war zone. Units moved constantly. Operational security meant that precise locations and movements were often unclear. A shipment could be sent to a unit that had already relocated, creating confusion that could be exploited. Third, trust. The United States military was training and arming the South Vietnamese as allies. Questioning their honesty too aggressively would undermine the entire partnership. There was institutional pressure to assume good faith. Tran exploited all three factors simultaneously. The operation worked like this. A weapons shipment would arrive at Tan Son Nut Air Base. Legitimate, documented, secure. Colonel Tran, as liaison officer, would review distribution requests from ARVN units. Some of these requests were real. Others were fabrications created by Tran himself, complete with forged signatures from South Vietnamese commanders who didn't exist or were dead. The shipments would be authorized by American logistics officers who had no way to verify the authenticity of South Vietnamese military paperwork. The weapons would be loaded onto trucks driven out of the depot, and they never reached their destination. Instead, the trucks would make unscheduled stops in remote areas at night, where other vehicles waited. The weapons would be transferred. The original crates would be filled with sand or scrap metal to maintain weight. The trucks would continue to a location where the crates would be discovered as damaged or destroyed in transit. Insurance paperwork would be filed. The incident would be written off. The weapons, meanwhile, were already moving along jungle trails toward Viet Cong base camps. But this system, sophisticated as it was, had vulnerabilities. It required silence. It required that anyone who noticed the pattern either didn't care or didn't survive to report it. Captain Richardson cared, and he kept investigating. In August of 1967, Richardson did something extraordinary. Without authorization, without backup, he followed one of the weapons trucks. He had identified a pattern in the missing shipments. They all went through the same depot. They were all signed for by the same South Vietnamese officer, a Lieutenant Pham, who Richardson could never actually locate for a face-to-face meeting. On August 15th, a shipment marked for Lieutenant Pham's unit was loaded onto a truck at dawn. Richardson, driving his own Jeep, followed at a distance. The truck didn't follow the route to any known ARVN position. Instead, it headed toward the Mekong Delta, into sparsely populated territory. Richardson followed for 2 hours. Then the truck turned onto a side road that led to an abandoned rubber plantation. Richardson stopped his Jeep and continued on foot. What he saw confirmed everything. The truck had stopped in a clearing. South Vietnamese soldiers or men in South Vietnamese uniforms were unloading crates. But they weren't alone. Other men in civilian clothes were helping. The weapons were being transferred to sampans on a nearby river. Richardson took photographs with a small camera he'd brought. He documented everything: the trucks, the transfer, the boats heading down river. He had evidence. He'd never had the chance to deliver it. 3 days after his unauthorized surveillance operation, Captain James Richardson was found dead in his quarters in Saigon. The official cause of death: accidental overdose of sleeping pills and alcohol. His photographs were never found. His confidential reports disappeared from the files. His investigation was closed. The weapons pipeline continued operating for 2 more years, arming the enemy that would kill American soldiers in battles like Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive, with weapons paid for by American taxpayers, handed over by men wearing American uniforms. But Richardson wasn't the only one who knew, and the cover-up was about to get much more complicated. The Central Intelligence Agency had been aware of weapons losses in Vietnam since early 1967, months before Captain Richardson began his investigation. But their interest wasn't in stopping the theft. It was in understanding who was facilitating it. Enter Thomas Morgan, 38 years old, CIA Special Operations Officer, 12 years of experience in Southeast Asia. Morgan had been embedded in Saigon since 1965, ostensibly as a cultural liaison officer attached to the embassy. His real job was counterintelligence. By mid-1967, Morgan was running a covert operation to identify and track double agents within the South Vietnamese military and government. His operation had a code name, Project Snapshot. Morgan's approach was different from military investigators like Richardson. He wasn't trying to stop the weapons theft. He was trying to map the network. Who was involved? How did the chain of command work? Where did the intelligence flow? The weapons losses were being used as bait to identify enemy agents. It was a calculated risk. Every rifle that disappeared might be used against American forces. But if Morgan could identify the full network, the payoff would be massive. A chance to dismantle North Vietnamese intelligence operations in the South. The problem was that Project Snapshot had discovered something Morgan's superiors didn't want to hear. The network included Americans. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. Certain logistics officers consistently approved shipments that later went missing. Certain intelligence officers seemed remarkably unconcerned about the losses. Certain commanders shut down investigations before they could gain momentum. Morgan couldn't determine whether these Americans were enemy agents, corrupt profiteers selling weapons on the black market, or simply incompetent officers making catastrophic mistakes. What he did know was that the pattern of complicity went beyond what chance could explain. In June of 1967, Morgan identified his primary target, Colonel Nguyen Van Tran. Surveillance revealed that Tran was living far beyond his official salary. He maintained a villa in a wealthy Saigon neighborhood. He drove an expensive car. His children attended private schools. Morgan began tapping Tran's communications. What he discovered was worse than he'd imagined. Tran wasn't just a profiteer selling weapons for personal gain. He was a committed North Vietnamese agent, a true believer in the cause. The money he earned from the weapons pipeline didn't go to personal luxury. It was being funneled back to Hanoi to support the war effort. And Tran wasn't the top of the network. He reported to someone higher, someone Morgan couldn't identify through surveillance alone. Morgan made a decision. He would recruit an informant inside Tran's operation, someone close enough to know the full scope, but low enough in the hierarchy to be approachable. The person he chose was a young South Vietnamese lieutenant named Coy. Lieutenant Coy worked directly under Colonel Tran, handling much of the administrative paperwork for weapons transfers. Morgan approached Coy in September of 1967, offering money and eventual safe passage to the United States in exchange for information. Coy agreed, but he had one condition: protection. He was terrified that if Tran discovered the betrayal, Coy's entire family would be killed. Morgan promised protection. It was a promise he couldn't keep. Within weeks of being recruited, Lieutenant Coy began passing information to Morgan. The details were explosive. The weapons pipeline wasn't just supplying Viet Cong guerrillas, it was arming entire North Vietnamese army divisions. The scale of the operation was far larger than anyone in American intelligence had estimated. Thousands of weapons, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, even heavy equipment, mortars, machine guns, anti-aircraft ammunition. And Coy confirmed Morgan's worst suspicion. Americans were knowingly facilitating the transfers. Coy had personally witnessed American officers signing off on shipments they knew were going to the enemy. In some cases, the Americans were being paid. In other cases, they were being blackmailed. In at least one case, the officer appeared to be ideologically sympathetic to the North Vietnamese cause. Coy provided names, not many. The operational security was tight, but enough to be devastating. A major in logistics, a captain in intelligence, a civilian contractor. Morgan compiled the information into a comprehensive report and sent it through classified channels to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The response he received shocked him. He was ordered to stand down. Project Snapshot was being terminated. All surveillance on Colonel Tran was to cease immediately. The evidence Morgan had collected was to be destroyed. The informant, Lieutenant Coy, was to be cut loose with no further contact or protection. No explanation was provided. Morgan was furious. He had evidence of treason. He had documented a pipeline that was directly contributing to American casualties, and he was being told to bury it. He violated his orders. Instead of destroying the evidence, he made copies. He hid them in a safe location in Saigon, and he began his own investigation into why Project Snapshot had been shut down. What Morgan discovered would haunt American intelligence for decades. The weapons pipeline wasn't just being tolerated, it was being protected. But not by enemy sympathizers or corrupt officers. It was being protected by senior American intelligence officials who saw it as strategically useful. The reasoning was coldly pragmatic. The weapons being stolen and transferred to the Viet Cong were being tracked. Every serial number was recorded. American intelligence was using the weapons as a tracer, monitoring where they appeared on the battlefield. When U.S. forces encountered enemy units using American weapons, intelligence analysts could track the weapons' origin points, inferring supply routes and base camp locations. In theory, the losses were acceptable collateral damage in exchange for intelligence about enemy positions and movements. In practice, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The intelligence gained was minimal. The cost in American lives was substantial. And worst of all, the policy required looking the other way while American weapons killed American soldiers. Morgan couldn't accept it. He began drafting a report that would expose the entire operation, including the names of the senior officials who had authorized the stand down. He never finished the report. On October 23, 1967, Thomas Morgan attended a meeting at a cafe in Saigon with a contact from the South Vietnamese police. The meeting was supposed to be routine, gathering information about local black market activity. Morgan never returned from that meeting. His body was found 2 days later in a drainage canal on the outskirts of the city. He had been shot once in the back of the head. The South Vietnamese police ruled it a robbery gone wrong. Morgan's wallet was missing. So was his identification. So were any documents he had been carrying. The American embassy accepted the South Vietnamese explanation. No further investigation was conducted. Lieutenant Coy, Morgan's informant, disappeared a week later. His family reported him missing. No body was ever found. The assumption was that Colonel Tran had discovered Coy's betrayal and had him executed. Coy's family fled to relatives in the countryside. They survived the war, but never spoke publicly about what happened. Project Snapshot was officially closed. All files were classified at the highest level. The officers Morgan had named in his preliminary reports were quietly transferred to different postings. None faced disciplinary action. Colonel Nguyen Van Tran continued his work unimpeded, and the weapons continued to flow. But Morgan had made copies, hidden them. Somewhere in Saigon, evidence existed that could expose the entire conspiracy. The CIA spent years trying to find those documents. They never did. In 1973, when American forces withdrew from Vietnam, the secret died with the fall of Saigon, or so everyone believed, until a cardboard box was discovered in a government archive in 1998, marked only with a series of numbers and a classification stamp that should have ensured it was destroyed decades earlier. Inside were Morgan's files. Everything he had documented, every name, every shipment, every piece of evidence. The truth had been hidden for 30 years. Now it was about to become public. The discovery of Morgan's files in 1998 should have been a major scandal. It contained evidence of systematic weapons trafficking, American complicity, and the murders of at least 2 people who tried to expose the operation. Instead, the files were quietly reclassified and sealed for another 25 years. The official explanation was that releasing the information could jeopardize intelligence sources and methods even decades after the fact. But the real reason was simpler. The files named names, and some of those names belonged to people who were still alive, still powerful, still able to make problems disappear. One of those names was David Keller. In 1967, Keller was a young CIA analyst, barely 30 years old, working in the Saigon station. By 1998, he was the Deputy Director of Operations for the entire agency. He had spent 3 decades building a reputation as one of the most effective intelligence officers in American history. Morgan's files threatened to destroy that legacy, because according to the documents, David Keller wasn't just aware of the weapons pipeline. He had helped design the policy that protected it. He had been one of the senior officials who ordered Project Snapshot to be shut down. He had signed off on the decision to cut loose Lieutenant Coy, despite knowing the man would likely be killed. Keller had made a calculated decision in 1967. The intelligence value of tracking the weapons outweighed the moral cost of the American lives lost. 30 years later, that decision would be revealed as a disaster. The intelligence gained had been minimal. The cost had been catastrophic, and the cover-up had been criminal. When the archived discovery was reported to CIA leadership in 1998, Keller was informed immediately. he convened a meeting with the agency's general counsel and the director of Central Intelligence. The discussion lasted less than an hour. The decision was unanimous. The files would be sealed. No investigation would be conducted. No apologies would be issued. The past would remain buried. One person disagreed. Sarah Brennan, a junior CIA historian who had been the one to discover the files. Brennan had read through the documents. She understood what they represented, and she believed the families of the soldiers killed by those stolen weapons deserved to know the truth. Brennan was told in no uncertain terms that if she spoke publicly about the files, she would be prosecuted for violating the Espionage Act. Her career would be destroyed. She would face criminal charges. She was 28 years old. She had student loans. She had a family. She had a future to protect. She stayed silent for 5 years. In 2003, Sarah Brennan left the CIA. She had become disillusioned with the agency's culture of secrecy and its willingness to prioritize institutional reputation over accountability. She didn't immediately go public with what she knew. She understood the legal risks. But she began carefully, quietly reaching out to journalists and researchers she trusted, providing guidance without directly revealing classified information. She pointed them toward declassified documents that corroborated parts of the story. She suggested lines of inquiry. She connected dots without drawing the full picture. Slowly, pieces of the story began to emerge. In 2007, an investigative journalist named Michael Torres published an article in a small but respected national security magazine. The article was titled, "Ghost Weapons, the Vietnam Arms Pipeline Nobody Wanted to Stop." Torres didn't have access to Morgan's files. Those were still classified. But he had found other documents through Freedom of Information Act requests, personnel records, after-action reports, casualty data, financial audits. He had pieced together enough to ask dangerous questions. Why did weapons losses spike in certain periods? Why were investigations shut down? Why were whistleblowers transferred or silenced? Why did American units repeatedly encounter enemy forces armed with brand new U.S. weapons whose serial numbers traced back to shipments reported as lost or destroyed just weeks earlier? Torres's article created a minor stir in national security circles, but didn't generate mainstream attention. The story was too complex. The evidence was too circumstantial. And the CIA issued a blanket denial, calling the article speculative conspiracy theory based on incomplete information. But the article did accomplish one thing. It brought Sarah Brennan back into the fight. Brennan contacted Torres. She didn't reveal classified information directly, but she confirmed that his investigation was pointing in the right direction. She told him there were documents that would prove everything, and she told him where to look. Torres spent the next 2 years filing Freedom of Information Act requests, appealing rejections, and slowly prying loose bits of information from government archives. He was meticulous, patient, persistent. In 2009, he finally got a breakthrough. A judge ruled that certain Vietnam-era operational files had been improperly classified and ordered their release with appropriate redactions. Among those files was a heavily redacted copy of Thomas Morgan's Project Snapshot final report. The names were blacked out. The specific shipment details were removed, but the core narrative was intact. a systematic weapons pipeline, protected at high levels, resulting in American casualties, covered up through murder and bureaucratic suppression. Torres published a second article, this time with documentary evidence. It generated significantly more attention. News outlets picked up the story. Veterans groups demanded answers. Congressional representatives began asking questions. The CIA's response was swift and predictable. The files were taken out of context. The operations described were standard counterintelligence work. Regrettable mistakes were made, as happens in any war, but there was no evidence of intentional wrongdoing or systematic cover-up. David Keller, now retired but still influential, issued a statement through his lawyer. He categorically denied any wrongdoing. He stated that all decisions made during his time in Vietnam were consistent with intelligence best practices and were made with the goal of protecting American lives. It looked like the story would once again fade into obscurity. A brief controversy, a stern denial, and then silence. But Sarah Brennan had one final card to play. In March of 2010, Sarah Brennan testified before a closed session of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. She violated no classification laws. She revealed no specific operational details, but she told the committee that documents existed, documents she had personally seen, that would prove systematic criminal misconduct during the Vietnam War, including the murder of American military personnel who had attempted to expose the misconduct. She told the committee that those documents had been improperly classified for political reasons, not national security reasons. And she named David Keller as one of the officials responsible for both the original misconduct and the subsequent cover-up. The committee was shocked, but they were also cautious. Keller was a legend in intelligence circles. Accusing him of criminal conspiracy based on one witness's testimony was politically dangerous. They ordered an internal CIA review of the files. The review was conducted by the agency's Inspector General and took 6 months. The conclusion was carefully worded. The Inspector General's report, released in redacted form in December 2010, confirmed that serious irregularities had occurred in Vietnam-era weapons tracking. It confirmed that investigations had been prematurely terminated for reasons that were not adequately documented. It confirmed that at least 2 individuals who had been investigating these irregularities had died under circumstances that were not fully explained, but the report stopped short of accusing anyone of criminal conduct. It attributed the problems to institutional failures, inadequate oversight, and operational pressures unique to the wartime environment. David Keller was not named in the report. No current or former CIA official faced any disciplinary action. The weapons pipeline that had armed the Viet Cong for years, that had contributed to the deaths of American soldiers, that had been protected through murder and bureaucratic suppression, was officially classified as an institutional failure. Sarah Brennan resigned from government work entirely. She gave one final interview to Michael Torres, speaking carefully to avoid classified information. Her message was simple. The truth exists. It's documented. But powerful people have decided that protecting themselves is more important than accountability. The full Morgan files remain classified as of 2025. The 25-year seal imposed in 1998 was set to expire in 2023, but the CIA filed for an extension. David Keller died in 2019 at age 82. His obituary in major newspapers praised his decades of service and made no mention of Vietnam. Colonel Nguyen Van Tran died in Vietnam in 2007. According to Vietnamese state media, he was honored as a war hero and received a state funeral. No mention was made of how he had obtained the weapons that made him so successful. Captain James Richardson is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His death certificate still lists the cause as accidental overdose. His family spent years trying to get the ruling changed, but the Army refused to reopen the investigation. Thomas Morgan is also buried in Arlington. His gravestone identifies him as a State Department officer killed in Vietnam. No mention is made of the CIA. No mention is made of Project Snapshot. No mention is made of why he died. There are estimated to be between 300 and 500 American soldiers who were killed in Vietnam by weapons that originated from the pipeline Morgan and Richardson tried to expose. Their families have never been told the truth about how the enemy obtained those weapons. The files exist, hidden in a government archive, sealed behind classification stamps, waiting for someone brave enough or powerful enough to force them into the light. Until then, the truth remains what it has always been: classified.